just want to talk really around and about my book and give you some idea of the sorts of things that I argue in it and that I say in it. I'm going to try and be brief so that we have a lot of time for questions and answers. So, but at the same time, that will mean that I will not cover some points to your satisfaction, but then it's better we talk about it in the question and answer session. Okay, so I'd like to start with an anecdote. I began to arrive at the arguments that I make about globalization in this book in the early 2000s, and I first put it down in the year 2002, and then about a year later, I was asked to be part of a panel on globalization in my university. I think 4 speakers, and we were told that we should have a meeting before the panel so that we could all discuss what we were going to say, because time would be short and we did not want to have a lot of overlap. So we met to discuss what each of us was going to say. So when we met, one of my colleagues began, the one who began, he said, well, I'm going to argue that globalization is a wonderful thing and it's going to free the world, productive forces of the world, and increase world wealth and prosperity and all those wonderful things. And then the second colleague said, oh no, this is terrible. I'm going to argue that globalization is an unmitigated disaster. It is raining poverty and destruction all over the world, and it's a terrible thing. And then my third colleague said, well, and I'm going to argue that whether you like it or not, globalization is inevitable. It's coming, and so we all have to deal with it. And so I was listening to all of this and I said, all right, and I'm going to argue that globalization is over. Because today there are some who argue that the United States and the US dollar are still hegemonic. And then there are others who there are others who argue that the United States and the dollar were once hegemonic, but they are no longer hegemonic. But there is, so far as I know, no one who argues that the United States and the dollar were never hegemonic. And so this argument, these 2 arguments about globalization and empire are the most, how can I say, they are the most specific arguments of 3 arguments that I make. And as it happens, I came up with a very Russian metaphor for describing the relationship between these 3 arguments. I say that they are like matryoshka dolls. So the smallest is this one that I just told you, and then there are 2 other slightly larger arguments that encase those arguments. And I must say that just as I was speaking, I remembered why matryoshka dolls occurred to me, and you'll remember this easily. I was a child when I was introduced to my first matryoshka dolls at my grandfather's place. My mother's father worked for a big film production company, had in fact been to Russia, and had brought back, of course, the inevitable matryoshka dolls. That's how this woman who grew up in India had them written into her mind at a very young age. Okay, so the other 2 arguments, then I'll begin now with the most general argument, and I just want to talk about them very briefly, and then I want to spend most of my time talking about why the dollar could never be hegemonic. But let me just tell you briefly what the other 2 arguments are. So the most general argument is actually, Alan sort of referred to it, and which is simply that, as he likes to put it, when the invisible hand trembles, the visible hand of the state needs to come in and steady it. That is to say that the idea that capitalist economies are somehow purely economic entities in which the state plays either no role or a very minimal role is a myth. States are central to capitalist economies for 2 critical reasons. One is that, of course, capitalism suffers from internal contradictions that need to be managed. And of course, second, capitalism suffers from legitimacy deficits, which also need to be managed. So the states need to act not just within the domestic economy, but they also act internationally in order to, as I say, manage the contradictions of the capitalisms over which they oversee. So when I abandoned the idea that the United States was ever hegemonic, and I therefore abandoned the various theories about how the history of capitalism can be understood as a history of successive hegemonies, the theory of uneven and combined development. The way I look at it, and I think I'm quite, this is the best interpretation that I can come up with on my reading of the theory of uneven and combined development, is that both unevenness and capitalism's unevenness and combined development are state projects. That is to say that states act through a variety of ways, including imperialism, to try and maintain the uneven configuration of capitalist development that favors them. And it's a dialectic. So one arm is that this sort of state organized maintenance of uneven development. The other arm of the dialectic is a state-led contestation by contender states of that uneven development. So if Britain is hegemonic, then Germany emerges as a contender state to, so Britain acts through her imperial policies to maintain that uneven configuration that favors her. Germany comes along and contests that. Of course, you can have a capitalist combined development, but as we know, as you know, of course, better than anybody else, you also had communist or non-capitalist forms of combined development, as in the case of the USSR. Especially as far as Western understandings are concerned, I make two very critical revisions to the dominant understanding of uneven and combined development. Firstly, I insist that unevenness is also politically maintained and point to imperialism as the key way in which it was maintained. And secondly, I point out that combined development is not just a matter of backward countries skipping capitalism to arrive at some kind of post-capitalist or socialist society, but also critically involves looking at capitalist combined development, such as Germany's, such as, in fact, that of the United States. And one final point about this, I think that it's very important to underline this, because this was I guess an insight that really came to me as I was struggling with these problems. In the dialectic of uneven and combined development so far, despite the power of imperialism, despite the power of dominant states, in the long run what we have observed is that combined development has actually triumphed over the attempts to preserve certain uneven configurations of power, and this has been the chief mechanism through which productive capacity has spread around the world, thanks to combined development. It's not just the uneven spread of markets or British imperialism or whatever. The spread of productive capacity around the world is centrally the work of states engaging in combined development. In this process, it's important to understand that already in the late 19th century, the world had become effectively multipolar. When the classical theories of imperialism emerged to talk about imperial competition, they were precisely recognizing the existence of a number of powers. The effortless supremacy of Britain had been replaced by the imperial competition of a number of major capitalist powers. But so that dialectic has today brought us to the point of an even greater multipolarity. But, and I'll come back to this in a minute, but basically in this process, although combined development eventually triumphed, unevenness has so far been sufficiently dominant that its ideologies have been dominant, and its ideologies have been precisely what I call the cosmopolitan ideologies. And here I include free trade, 19th century free trade, globalization, and empire. All the ideologies that instruct us to think of the world economy as a seamless whole, whereas in fact it has been progressively divided up into national economies. So, and now my second argument will take much less time to explain. In this dialectic of uneven and combined development, the world dominance of the first industrial capitalist power in the world, namely the United Kingdom, was inevitable. But it was also unrepeatable. So basically the United States, and I demonstrate this, the United States policy making and political elites decided early in the 20th century they could see British power waning, and they consciously articulated their aspiration to replace Britain as the world's dominant power. But already by this time, the, the dialectic of uneven and combined development had advanced so far that a exact emulation was impossible. America could not acquire the sort of vast formal empire that the UK had. So the United States settled for what one may call dominance light or hegemony light. You understand the word light, like in Coca-Cola light, sugar-free, fat-free, etc. No colonies. So then what they settled for is, we are going to make the dollar the world's currency, and New York, as sterling had been, and New York the world's financial center, just as London had been. Okay, so the United States got the best chance that it was ever going to have to try and realize these aspirations after the Second World War. Because what the Second World War did was, on the one hand, it rained destruction on all its capitalist allies and rivals. That is to say, the rest of the capitalist world was destroyed, but at the same time, so one is brought down, the United States' productive capacity was boosted beyond belief. Between 1939 and 1945, the US economy nearly doubled in size. It would not double again for 22 years. 22 years which included the years of the golden years, the so-called golden age of capitalism. The reason was very, very simple. Or rather, let me put it another way. Most people see the period since 1945 as a period during which the dollar has been the world's money, no questions. In reality, what it has been is a series of attempts, each of which fails. So one attempt fails, the United States tries something else, again tries something else, one after another. And so what the book does for a goodly part of it is it maps all of these different attempts. But basically what you had was a series of attempts, all of which failed. And today, after the last crisis, we are looking at a situation in which it is not even possible for the United States to credibly mount another attempt. Reality has simply moved on far from there. Okay, so the fundamental reason why this was not possible is very simple. The United Kingdom could maintain the sterling's role as the world's currency because the United Kingdom exported capital. It could export capital for two reasons, or let me say 1.5 reasons. The one reason was it had colonies. And the colonies provided the surpluses, which then took the form of capital exports. And we can go into the geography of that, it's fascinating. The half reason, and I call it half because I think it was less powerful than the first one. During the decades of sterling's dominance, the working class was not sufficiently empowered. So the United Kingdom could export capital without worrying about maintaining high employment levels within the UK economy. Just winding this up with 2 or 3 points to end with. The UK also enjoyed the advantage of an imperial world economy which it dominated. The United States, on the other hand, was actually it was the biggest national economy in 1945 in the early years, but it was just one national economy among many. The United States also faced another big problem, which is that whereas the UK economy was itself a big empire, or it ran a big empire, the United States was actually faced with an international world in which combined development was now a greater force than ever before. For many reasons. Number one, the recovering economies needed to be allowed to have each their own forms of national capitalism if they were to remain capitalist and not become communist. Number two, communism itself existed. Not only did the Soviet Union make a great contribution to the war, enjoy tremendous legitimacy around the world, support developing countries and national self-determination around the world, etc. But it itself took away a huge swathe of the world's population and territory away from capitalist development. That is, these territories and populations were not available for capitalist development. And number three, of course, the newly independent countries were all basically going to, in fact, they all embarked on one or the other form of more or less successful combined development. In this context, if the United States was going to try and maintain its relative size, because that was important, at the end of the Second World War, US is half the world's production. If it's going to maintain even something resembling that size, it has to continue to grow. if it's going to maintain employment levels that are high enough to essentially to keep the lid on working class aspirations, it could not export capital, and it exported very little. We all here talk about Marshall aid. It was really very, very small if you think about the larger picture. So basically the United States could only provide the world with liquidity, provide the world with dollars by running deficits. And this way was subject to the so-called Triffin dilemma. If the United States ran deficits in order to provide the world with liquidity, it was completely counterproductive, because these very deficits led to a decline in the value of the dollar. People did not want to hold the currency of a country that was running such massive balance of payments deficits. So this logic led to the closing of the gold window in 1971, but it did not stop operating. It has continued to operate throughout this period. I think actually I will just leave it. Thank you very much.